Somewhere right now, someone is standing in front of a room, saying something they instantly regret, and their face is turning red before their brain has even finished processing the mistake. They didn't choose this. Nobody does. You can control your voice. You can control your words, your posture, even your breathing if you try hard enough. But you cannot control this. Within seconds, your face has already told everyone around you exactly how you feel, whether you wanted them to know or not. That should strike you as strange. Almost everything about human survival depends on concealment. We learned to hide fear so predators couldn't sense weakness. We learned to hide pain so rivals couldn't exploit it. We learned to mask hesitation in negotiations, in conflict, in courtship. Even young children learn quickly how to control their faces enough to hide disappointment or dishonesty when it benefits them. Hiding your internal state has been one of the most useful skills a human being can have, in almost every context imaginable. And yet, evolution left one glaring exception. A reaction so visible, so immediate, and so impossible to suppress that it seems to work against everything else our biology was built to do. So why does this exist? Why would natural selection preserve a trait that broadcasts vulnerability instead of hiding it? To answer that, we need to understand exactly what a blush is, where the idea that it matters came from, and why. More than a century after it was first studied seriously, scientists still consider it one of the more curious puzzles in human evolution. Let's start with a definition. A blush is an involuntary reddening of the skin, most noticeable on the face, neck, and upper chest, triggered by emotional states like embarrassment, shame, guilt, or even unexpected praise. It is not something you decide to do. It happens through the autonomic nervous system, the part of your body that also controls your heartbeat and digestion, systems you don't consciously operate. That single fact is the whole mystery in miniature. Nearly every other emotional expression, a smile, a frown, a raised eyebrow, involves some degree of choice or at least some capacity for suppression. A person can force a smile in a photograph or press their lips together to hide anger. Blushing does not offer that option. No amount of composure training, public speaking practice, or emotional discipline has ever been shown to eliminate it entirely. The first person to study this seriously wasn't a psychologist. It was Charles Darwin. In his 1872 work on the expression of emotions, Darwin devoted an entire section to blushing, and he considered it genuinely puzzling. He called it, in his own words, the most peculiar and most human of all expressions. Darwin noticed something important. Blushing appeared to be uniquely human, or at least dramatically more pronounced in humans than in any other species he studied. He collected reports from missionaries and travelers across different cultures, trying to determine whether blushing was universal or learned. He asked correspondents living among a wide range of societies whether local populations blushed visibly and under what circumstances. Most of the evidence he gathered suggested it appeared across very different societies, which pointed toward something biological rather than something taught. Darwin's interest matters because it reframes the entire question. He wasn't just cataloging a quirky reaction. He was trying to understand why evolution would produce something so seemingly disadvantageous. If blushing reveals internal states that a person might prefer to hide, what possible survival value could it carry? For over a century after Darwin, this question remained largely unresolved, discussed more in philosophy and psychology than in hard biology. To get closer to an answer, we need to look at what's physically happening inside the body during a blush. When a person experiences an emotionally triggering moment, particularly one involving social evaluation, such as being caught in a mistake, receiving unwanted attention, or feeling judged, the brain activates the sympathetic nervous system. This is the same system responsible for the fight or flight response. But instead of the classic pattern of increased heart rate and tensed muscles preparing for danger, something more specific happens in the face. Blood vessels near the surface of the skin, particularly in the cheeks, dilate. This is called vasodilation. More blood flows closer to the skin's surface, and because facial skin tends to be thinner and has a denser network of blood vessels than most other areas of the body, the reddening becomes visibly obvious in a way it wouldn't on, say, your forearm. Researchers have found that the face, and especially the cheeks, contains a particularly high concentration of these surface blood vessels combined with specific receptors that respond strongly to adrenaline. In simple terms, your face is physiologically primed to turn red more easily and more visibly than almost any other part of your body. This isn't incidental. The concentration of these receptors in exactly the area other people are looking at during a conversation is one of the details that makes some researchers suspect the reaction isn't just a biological side effect. It looks structurally like a signal. If blushing were simply a random byproduct of stress hormones, we might expect it to appear randomly across the body, not concentrated so precisely on the part of us that faces other people directly. That leads to the next major question. If blushing looks like a signal, who is it signaling to, and why would that matter for survival? This is where the evolutionary puzzle sharpens. Very few animals blush in any observable way. Some primates show reddening in specific contexts, often related to social hierarchy or mating displays. But the human blush, spontaneous, involuntary, tied specifically to social embarrassment and moral emotion, appears to be far more developed and far more socially specific than anything documented in other species. Humans seem to be the only animal that blushes in response to being caught doing something wrong in front of others. That specificity is important. Blushing isn't a general fear response. It isn't triggered by physical danger, like the sight of a predator or a sudden loud noise. It's almost always triggered by social exposure, being watched, being judged, being caught. This has led many evolutionary psychologists toward a theory known as honest signaling. Here's the idea. In evolutionary biology, a signal is considered honest when it's costly or difficult to fake, which makes it reliable. A confident verbal apology can be faked. Someone can say the right words while feeling nothing behind them. But a blush cannot be summoned on command. You cannot decide to blush convincingly the way you can decide to say sorry. Because it's involuntary, it becomes a kind of proof. It tells observers, this person is genuinely experiencing social discomfort about what just happened. In early human groups, where cooperation and trust between individuals were essential for survival, being able to demonstrate genuine remorse or awareness of a social mistake, without being able to fake it, may have carried real value. A person who blushes after violating a social norm is, in a strange way, providing evidence that they understand the norm and care about maintaining their standing within the group. This matters more than it might first appear, because small ancestral communities depended heavily on cooperation to survive. Sharing food, defending territory, raising children, and coordinating hunts all required a baseline level of trust between individuals who would interact with each other for years, sometimes for life. In that kind of environment, being able to identify who genuinely regretted a mistake versus who was simply pretending to regret it could influence whether that person was forgiven, trusted again, or excluded from future cooperation. Some researchers extend this further, suggesting blushing may have functioned as a repair mechanism for social relationships. If you accidentally offend someone or make an embarrassing mistake, an uncontrollable blush essentially broadcasts, "I know I messed up, and I care that you noticed." In small, tightly interdependent groups, where reputation and trust directly affected survival and cooperation, this kind of involuntary honesty could plausibly have been valuable enough to be preserved by natural selection. It's worth being careful here. This honest signal explanation is a leading theory in evolutionary psychology, not an established, universally agreed-upon fact. Blushing is difficult to study directly because it can't be reliably triggered on command in a laboratory setting, and much of the supporting evidence comes from behavioral studies rather than direct evolutionary proof. Researchers can't exactly ask ancient hunter-gatherers to fill out a survey about who they trusted more. Still, the theory fits an unusually consistent pattern across cultures and history. Speaking of history, the way societies interpreted blushing changed dramatically over time. In many periods of European history, particularly through the 18th and 19th centuries, blushing wasn't seen as embarrassing at all. It was frequently read as a sign of moral virtue, modesty, and sincerity. In Victorian-era England, an easily blushing person, especially a young woman, was often perceived as more trustworthy and more socially proper. Etiquette writers of the period occasionally referenced blushing as evidence of a delicate, honest character, something to be valued rather than concealed. In some literary and social contexts, an inability to blush was viewed with suspicion, as though it suggested a person incapable of shame or moral awareness, someone who might lie or manipulate without any visible cost. This cultural interpretation aligns closely with the honest signal theory. If blushing genuinely functions as proof of authentic emotional response, it makes sense that societies across different eras independently arrived at similar interpretations, associating it with sincerity rather than weakness, even without understanding the underlying biology. Interestingly, this wasn't limited to one culture or one century. Similar associations between visible emotional reactions and perceived honesty appear in various historical writings across different regions, though the specific meaning attached to blushing has shifted depending on local customs and gender expectations. But there's a flip side to this story, one that shows what happens when a normally helpful signal becomes overactive. For some people, blushing isn't an occasional response to a specific embarrassing moment. It becomes frequent, intense, and largely disconnected from any single triggering event. This condition is sometimes referred to as erythrophobia, an intense fear of blushing that often creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The person becomes anxious about the possibility of blushing, which activates the same sympathetic nervous system response, which then triggers the blush itself. The fear of the reaction becomes the cause of the reaction. This creates a loop that can be genuinely distressing, because the more a person tries to prevent it, the more likely their body is to produce it. This connects closely to broader research on social anxiety. Studies on social anxiety disorder frequently identify blushing as one of the most distressing physical symptoms reported by patients, precisely because it feels like an involuntary public confession of internal anxiety, even when no actual social mistake has occurred. Unlike a racing heart or sweaty palms, which can often go unnoticed by others, a blush is immediately visible, which makes it feel especially exposing for people who already struggle with social anxiety. In some more severe clinical cases, this has even led to surgical interventions targeting the sympathetic nerves responsible for facial blood flow, Although these procedures carry significant risks and are typically considered only after other treatments have failed. This clinical extreme actually reinforces the honest signal theory in an unexpected way. The system, at its core, evolved to respond specifically to social threat and judgment. When that threat detection becomes hypersensitive, the same mechanism that may have once helped build trust between early humans instead becomes a source of chronic distress. In other words, a trait that likely helped our ancestors form and repair social bonds can, in some people, become a source of ongoing suffering when the underlying threat detection system is thrown out of balance. So why does this reaction still exist today, in a world completely unlike the small, tightly bonded social groups our ancestors lived in? Modern life has, if anything, intensified the conditions blushing originally evolved to respond to. We are watched more than any humans in history, not just by the people physically around us, but through video calls, recorded meetings, and social media, where a single embarrassing moment can be witnessed by thousands of strangers. The core trigger for blushing, social evaluation, and the fear of judgment hasn't disappeared. It has multiplied. At the same time, the original evolutionary logic may have partially lost its usefulness. In a small ancestral group, everyone could see your blush and register your sincerity firsthand, often reinforcing a bond that would matter for the rest of both people's lives. In a video call or a text-based argument, that same reaction often goes completely unseen, offering none of its original social benefit, while still producing all of the internal discomfort. The biology hasn't caught up to the environment it now operates in. So let's return to that person standing in front of a room, saying something they instantly regret. Their face is turning red, not because something is malfunctioning, but because a very old, very specific piece of human biology is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is delivering an unfiltered, unfakeable signal that they are aware of the moment, that they care how it's perceived, and that whatever just happened, they are not indifferent to it. Blushing has often been treated as an embarrassing flaw, something to be controlled, hidden, or apologized for. But the evidence points towards something more interesting. It may be one of the oldest forms of honesty the human body has ever produced, a signal so old it predates language itself, and so deeply wired that no amount of willpower has ever been enough to override it. The next time your face gives you away, it might be worth remembering that it isn't betraying you. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do.